everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Second World War. And let's start today by telling a story. So, at the conclusion to the Second World War, Japan, though their military forces had been soundly defeated, stubbornly refused to negotiate an end to the conflict. Their militaristic leaders had committed to total war in defense of the Japanese Empire and were prepared to mobilize Japanese civilians to combat President Harry Truman and his advisors were therefore faced with a difficult choice. Either they could commit to a long and costly invasion of Japan, which they estimated would kill more than 1 million people, or they could use their secret weapon, the world's first nuclear bombs, which the United States had recently constructed. So, in order to shorten the war and avoid the need for an invasion, Truman decided to drop 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 major military and industrial targets. Demonstrating the extent of the Japanese military's desire to keep fighting, however, even after these bombs were dropped, Japan's Supreme Council remained deadlocked, with some military leaders still refusing to consider negotiating a peace. It took the unprecedented intervention of Emperor Hirohito to break the impasse in the council and finally convince the military to step down, bringing an end to the war. So that's quite a simple story there. And presented like this, dropping the nuclear bombs was pretty unambiguously the right and moral thing to do, when compared to the worse alternative anyway. What this is a basic trolley problem. You might not like dropping the nuclear bombs, but if the only other option on the table is a long, costly invasion that is definitely going to kill and injure even more people, then the bombs become acceptable and justifiable. And this is a popular and enduring perception of the events that led to the nuclear bombs being dropped, that they were used specifically to force Japan to surrender without the need for an invasion. However, this is Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, who was the senior-most United States military officer on active duty during World War II, and the personal chief of staff to Presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman. And after the war, with regards to the nuclear bombs, Leahy wrote the following. It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and bombing with conventional weapons. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who was Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet during World War II, said at a speech given on October 5th, 1945, the Japanese had, in fact, already sued for peace before the atomic age was announced to the world with the destruction of Hiroshima and before the Russian entry into the war. The atomic bomb played no decisive part from a purely military standpoint in the defeat of Japan. And this is General Dwight Eisenhower, who was Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe during World War II and later President of the United States. And his opinion of the atomic bomb was that the Japanese were ready to surrender and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. And Eisenhower later wrote in his memoirs about a conversation he had with War Secretary Henry Stimson, in which he states, I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose deployment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. It was my belief that Japan was, at that very moment, seeking some way to surrender. And in 1944, President Roosevelt directed Henry Stimson to put together a survey team to write a report on the effectiveness of the Allied aerial bombing tactics during the war. Published in 1946, the Strategic Bombing Survey came to the conclusion that Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. So, what's going on here then? The people I just quoted there were all involved in the Second World War in important positions of political and military power. And instead of viewing the bombs as a necessary lesser of two evils, they instead see them as everything from simply militarily necessary to a grave moral crime. Now, obviously, if these people are correct that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not necessary to end the war, then the trolley problem version of the story we told at the start of the video can't be true, can it? So this is what we're here to investigate today. which of these versions of history is closer to the truth? We're going to take a look at the closing months of the Second World War in the lead up to the atomic bombings. And I think we should start today by briefly introducing the various people that we're going to be talking about, a few of whom we've mentioned already. So first off, in the United States we have President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was in office for most of the Second World War. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, meaning that his vice president Harry Truman became president, and he was in office for the remainder of the war, including the period when the nuclear bombs were dropped. Working for Truman, we have Chief of Staff Admiral William D. Leahy, who was one of the people we just quoted who thought the bombs were unnecessary, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, who was the person to whom Eisenhower voiced his misgivings about the bomb, and Secretary of State James F. Burns. And spoiler warning, this man in particular makes a lot of very poor decisions. Leahy and Stimson both served in the same roles under Roosevelt, but James F. Burns was appointed Secretary of State by Harry Truman on July 3, 1945. The nuclear bombs themselves were constructed by the Manhattan Project, which was directed by General Leslie Groves, and the actual laboratory that designed the bombs was headed by J. Robert Oppenheimer. Over in Japan, at the top of the Japanese government, we have Emperor Hirohito, and he was advised by the Supreme Council for the direction of the war. The Supreme Council had 6 members, and they, for the most part, fell into 2 factions, the moderates and the hardliners. So for the moderates, we have Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Minister of Foreign Affairs Shigenori Togo, and Minister of the Navy Mitsumasa Yori. And for the hardliners, we have Minister of War Korechika Anami, Chief of the Army General Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Chief of the Navy General Staff Soemu Toyoda. We'll get more into the differences between these groups in a little while, but generally the hardliners favoured a more hardline military strategy and the moderates were more moderate. Also important for us here is Naotake Sato, the Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union, who was in frequent contact with Minister of Foreign Affairs Shigenori Togo, and the messages sent between Togo and Sato are key to understanding the thinking of the Japanese leadership at the time. Outside of the US and Japan, we have British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Premier of the Soviet Union Joseph Stalin. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. Now, of course, there were many more people than this involved in the end of the Second World War, and I'll be mentioning more people going forward. This list comprises only the most principal actors in the particular events that we're going to be talking about today. As well as people, there's going to be a lot of dates and events to remember here, so I'm going to be using a calendar going forward so that we can keep track of everything. The 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August, respectively, and we've also already mentioned the inauguration of Harry Truman on the 12th of April, and his appointing of James Burns to Secretary of State on the 3rd of July. As we go through the events leading up to the bombings, I'll add more to this calendar and highlight which days I'm talking about in particular, and hopefully this will help us to keep organised. Before all that though, there is one important event we need to know about prior to the Second World War, and that's the Russo-Japanese War fought between 1904 and 1905. Now I won't dwell on this too long, but the very quick Wikipedia summary goes like this. The Russo-Japanese War was fought between the Russian and Japanese empires over rival imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. So it's 2 empires fighting over land and influence in Asia, basically. Anyway, in this war, Russia suffered a series of humiliating and surprising defeats at the hands of Japan, a nation that Russia was expecting to beat relatively easily. Perhaps most notable of these defeats is the Battle of Tsushima, where virtually a whole Russian fleet was sunk by the Japanese Navy, who suffered only minor losses themselves. Russia was forced to sue for peace, which was mediated in the United States by President Theodore Roosevelt, and the resulting treaty saw Russia withdrawing their troops from Manchuria, recognizing Japan's claim to Korea, as well as ceding a bunch of territory. All this, coupled with the fact that the Japanese Empire had initiated the war with a surprise attack on the Russian-occupied Port Arthur, meant that the Russians were, to put it lightly, rather ticked off about the whole affair. The disastrous Russian performance in the war is considered one of the main instigating factors behind the 1905 Russian Revolution, but that's a story for another day. So to summarise and generalise a bit, Russia held a grudge against Japan for beating them in a war and denying them influence and territory in Asia. This is all important in the context of the Yalta Conference, which took place between the 4th and 11th of February. This was a meeting of Stalin, Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt to discuss, among other things, the post-war reorganization of Europe. Nazi Germany was on its last legs at this point. Its defeat was inevitable. Adolf Hitler shot himself on the 30th of April, and the German High Command surrendered unconditionally on May the 7th. And the Yalta Conference was held to discuss and negotiate the various things that should happen following that upcoming Nazi defeat. The main focus of the conference was Europe, but important for us here is that the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan was discussed. Churchill and Roosevelt wanted Stalin to declare war on Japan. Specifically, they wanted him to invade Japanese-occupied Manchuria, which would make Japan have to fight on an extra front and spread their resources thinner, and this would hopefully hasten their defeat. Now, this was a little bit awkward, as Russia and Japan had signed a non-aggression pact in 1941, and that wasn't due to expire until 1946. Despite this non-aggression pact, Stalin also wanted Russia to declare war against Japan. However, he wanted something in return, so on the 11th of February, the Allies signed a secret protocol agreeing that Russia would enter the war against Japan, quote, 2 or 3 months after Germany has surrendered and the war in Europe is terminated. The price for Russia's doing so was that the former rights of Russia violated by the treacherous attack of Japan in 1904 shall be restored. And then they're all listed there. So basically, Stalin was asked to declare war on Japan after the war in Europe was finished. He said, okay, but we want back all the stuff that Japan pinched off us back in 1904. Churchill and Roosevelt agreed, and so the deal was made. And this deal was kept secret for a few reasons. Mainly because Russia is very big. It's going to take quite a bit of time for the Soviet Union to transfer military forces from the west to the east. They didn't want to risk tipping Japan off to the impending invasion of Manchuria before it was ready to go ahead. President Roosevelt, for his part, thought this was a fair deal. He later stated that the Russians, quote, only want to get back that which has been taken from them. However, James Burns, then acting as advisor to Roosevelt at Yalta, worried that the more the United States asked of the Soviet Union, the more they would demand in return. Writing in his memoirs after the war, Burns makes it clear that he thinks too much was conceded to the Russians at Yalta, although he is careful to give reasons as to why he thinks the late President Roosevelt made the decisions he did. Burns does point out, however, that at the time the terms of the secret protocol were decided upon, he didn't know about them and thus had no influence over them because he was not Secretary of State. Mr. Stettinius was secretary, referring to Edward Stettinius Jr., who was Roosevelt's Secretary of State at Yalta. This is important for us here because although Truman kept on other of Roosevelt's staff after his death, he chose to replace Stettinius, feeling that too many concessions had been made to the Soviet Union at Yalta. And his new pick for Secretary of State was James Burns, a choice which signals a change towards a more aggressive stance with regards to Russia, which leaves the United States in a bit of an awkward situation, diplomatically speaking. Under the previous president and Secretary of State, they'd signed a secret agreement with the Soviet Union, assuring them various concessions in exchange for going to war against Japan. But then that president died, and his Secretary of State was replaced. And the incoming president and Secretary of State aren't at all as keen on conceding anything to the Russians. And I wonder if that's going to cause any problems down the line. So let's leave the Allies in their awkward situation there and discuss what the Japanese government was up to during this time. And to oversimplify a little, throughout this whole period, the Japanese leadership had basically a single main aim, and that was to avoid having to accept an unconditional surrender and instead achieve a negotiated peace. The Supreme Council in Japan knew that they couldn't win the war, but they wanted peace on terms that they could negotiate. Nazi Germany, of course, was forced to accept an unconditional surrender by the Allies. Unconditional surrender here meaning surrender without any guarantees being made to the losing side. And Japan was very keen to avoid a similar fate. The main sticking point was the question of Japan's imperial institution and the fate of the emperor in particular. The emperor was more than just a regular old leader in Japanese society. He was a revered, quasi-divine figure of particularly special importance. And with his position as the head of the Japanese government, and importantly the Japanese military, Japan accepting unconditional surrender meant that the emperor could then conceivably be arrested and tried for war crimes and possibly even executed. This was something that Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, when advising General MacArthur, described as comparable to the crucifixion of Christ to us. The United States was very aware of the special position of the Emperor and the gravity of the question of what should be done with him, but we'll get to that a little later. Now, there were disagreements in Japan's Supreme Council about what exact peace terms they should attempt to negotiate. On the more pessimistic, or realistic end of the scale, we have Japan just getting out of the war however they can with the preservation of the imperial institution. So basically accepting whatever peace terms are offered so long as they guarantee the emperor's position. And on the more optimistic, or unrealistic end of the scale, we have Japan getting out of the war while securing the preservation of the imperial institution, securing the preservation of Japan's military forces, avoiding a foreign occupation, maintaining Japan's occupied overseas territories, and ensuring any trials for Japanese war crimes were carried out by Japan. Now, this was all never going to happen, obviously, but it was argued for. The hardline militarists on the council were very keen on the preservation of the military, believe it or not. Holding out for these terms was obviously a desperate long shot, but these were equally desperate men. Regardless of these disagreements, though, the Supreme Council was unified on the first point. They were absolutely not going to lose the Emperor, and therefore they want to avoid an unconditional surrender at any cost. And they pursued this goal both militarily and diplomatically. And let's talk about military strategy first. So the militarists on the Supreme Council favoured a strategy of making the war so difficult for the Allies that they would lose their taste for unconditional surrender and decide to negotiate peace, rather than fight on for another year or so at huge cost to themselves. So Japan wasn't going to win the war. They knew that, but they were going to end it on terms that were more acceptable to them. The Council anticipated an upcoming Allied invasion of Japan and planned to throw everything they had at it, including civilians, in order to wear down the Allied will to fight, and thus secure better terms. A similar situation played out in miniature on the island of Okinawa. Now, Okinawa was occupied by the Japanese military, and when the US military invaded it, local inhabitants of the island, including children, were conscripted by the Japanese military and sent to die by the thousands. And by the time Okinawa was captured by the Allies on July the 2nd, both the Japanese and US militaries had lost considerable amounts of lives and military equipment. It was both a very costly loss and a very costly victory. President Truman, for his part, was very concerned about the losses at Okinawa and feared that committing to a full invasion of Japan could mean, quote, an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. So that's the Supreme Council's military strategy there. Diplomatically, the Council's plan was to convince the Soviet Union to mediate a peace between Japan and the other allies, much like the United States had mediated peace at the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Japan was counting on the pact of neutrality they had with the Soviet Union to keep the Russians out of the war. They hoped that they would have a better chance at securing favourable peace terms if they had the Soviet Union backing them up. And in exchange for helping them with negotiations, the Japanese leadership was prepared to offer Stalin various territorial concessions from their empire. Now, unfortunately for the Japanese people, both the military and diplomatic strategies of the Japanese leadership were, to put it bluntly, rubbish. To take the diplomatic strategy first, in trying to persuade Stalin to help them out, they were bargaining from a position of weakness. They had nothing to offer the Soviet Union that it was not in a position to just take for itself. Stalin didn't want the war to end before he'd had the chance to invade and recapture the territory that had already been promised to him at the Yalta Conference. So why bargain with Japan in exchange for helping them when you could just invade them and take whatever you like? Stalin wanted to be in at the kill, as he put it, and he wasn't about to grant Japan a stay of execution. To accomplish this impossible diplomatic task, Minister of Foreign Affairs Shigenori Togo sent frequent messages to Japan's ambassador in Moscow, Naotake Sato, instructing him to somehow convince the Russians to help Japan broker peace. Now, Sato was rather a lot more realistic than his colleagues back in Tokyo. He knew the Russians, he realised that the council's plan was almost certainly not going to work, and he didn't mind telling them. In a series of increasingly frank messages sent in response to Togo's instructions, Sato attempted to make his superiors see sense. And let's quote a few of his cables here. It seems extremely unlikely that Russia would flout the Anglo-Americans and the opinion of the entire world by supporting Japan's war efforts with either moral or material means. I believe in the long run Japan has indeed no choice but to accept unconditional surrender or terms closely equivalent. I believe that Stalin feels there is absolutely no necessity for making a voluntary agreement with Japan. On this point I see a serious discrepancy between your view and the actual state of affairs, which is a wonderfully insulting line. Togo, however, didn't appreciate his subordinate's candor. He responded to one of Sato's complaints, quote, "In spite of your views, you must carry out your instructions. Endeavour to obtain the good offices of the Soviet Union in ending the war, short of unconditional surrender." And this is the general pattern of communication that went on between the two. Togo asked Sato to do the impossible. Sato attempted to explain that it was impossible. Togo told him to shut up, shut your face, just do it anyway, please. Thank you. And it's worth noting here that the Allies had cracked the Japanese communication codes and were freely reading Japan's messages, so they were privy to all of this information, as well as Togo and Sato's back and forth comedy routine they were working on. Now, militarily, the strategy of the Supreme Council was just as ill-fated as their diplomatic efforts. Expecting the opposing side to lose their nerve and call it quits faster than you, when it's your territory being invaded and occupied, is quite a risky strategy. It's also a strategy that hinges on the enemy first doing something that you expect them to do, that being here to invade Japan at all. An Allied invasion of Japan was not guaranteed to happen. The United States was working on plans to possibly invade Japan should it be necessary, but we should not make the mistake of thinking that because an invasion was being planned for, that it was an inevitability. President Truman wrote in his diary on the 17th of June, "Shall we invade Japan proper, or shall we bomb and blockade?" And this is before the Trinity test, before Truman knows that he has nuclear bombs to work with, or the effectiveness of those nuclear bombs. Before that, he's presenting an invasion as only one possible way forward. At the start of the video, I quoted several US military leaders who thought Japan would have surrendered prior to an invasion being necessary, regardless of the use of nuclear bombs. For example, Admiral Leahy, who described Japan as already defeated and ready to surrender. But just how defeated was Japan? Let's briefly talk about the state of the Japanese military. So firstly, by the middle of 1945, the Japanese Navy was virtually non-existent. Every Japanese aircraft carrier had been either sunk or disabled, hundreds of warships had been destroyed, and after the United States captured Okinawa, Japan's few remaining battleships were either decommissioned or used as stationary anti-aircraft platforms because Japan simply lacked the fuel to keep them moving. Outside of suicide attacks by small vessels, the Japanese Navy had ceased to exist, and that's not a rhetorical flourish by me there, that's a quote from the US summary report of the Pacific War. In the air, Japan was faring no better. There was a shortage of bombers, fighters, trained pilots, materials to construct aircraft out of, and fuel to keep them in the air. As you'll probably be aware, by the end of the war, Japan was resorting to suicide missions carried out by poorly trained pilots, instructed to simply crash their planes into enemy ships. Due in part to the rushed training of the pilots and the increasingly poor construction of the aircraft they were flying, fewer than a fifth of these planes actually hit their targets. On the other side, the United States Air Force was conducting constant bombing raids on targets inside Japan, basically as it pleased, meeting little to no resistance in the air. General Curtis LeMay, the man in charge of America's air offensive against Japan, later claimed that he did not lose a single B-29 bomber to Japanese fighters. And to quote the strategic bombing survey I mentioned near the start of the video, United States planes crisscrossed the skies with no effective Japanese air or anti-aircraft opposition. Given its collapse both in the air and at sea, a naval blockade was able to be put in place around Japan, which firstly was absolutely devastating for the Japanese economy. Almost their entire merchant fleet was picked off and destroyed, and imports of vital resources like coal, crude oil, iron ore, and rubber stopped. As a result, many Japanese ports, such as the one at Hiroshima, simply ceased to operate. The blockade also had the effect of dramatically reducing the scattered Japanese ground forces' ability to communicate, resupply, and redeploy. Without their navy, Japan's troops were increasingly undersupplied as well as stranded wherever they happened to be. So, given the absolutely dismal state of the Japanese military situation, it is presumptuous of the Supreme Council to assume that the United States had to commit to a costly ground invasion at all. The Americans could, if they wanted to, simply maintain their naval blockade and bombing campaign, and there would be very little that the Japanese leadership could do about it. They were counting on the United States first launching an invasion, and only then losing faith in it. Of course, another possibility is that the United States could decide they didn't want to do a ground invasion before they started one, which is of course what happened, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves there. Now, it is clear from their awful, unsalvageable military situation that Japan's leaders should have surrendered much sooner than they did, and indeed some wanted to, but so long as the hardline militarist faction in the Supreme Council insisted on continuing the war, there was little that those who desired peace could do about it. Directly, anyway. Behind the scenes, members of the Japanese leadership who realised that the war needed to be finished were working on plans to that end, but we'll get to those in due time. For now, though, the Supreme Council remained deadlocked, and the terribly sad thing about all this is that while the leadership of Japan waited uselessly for either an American ground invasion or rescue from the Soviet Union, their civilian population centres were being systematically destroyed. And here we need to introduce the concept of strategic bombing, that being the intentional targeting of enemy cities with area bombing raids with the aim of destroying the enemy's morale and industry. Now, strategic bombing is interesting in that its name changes depending on who is doing it to who. When we're doing it to them, it's called strategic morale bombing, and it's a calculated, emotionless tactic intended to bring a swift end to the war by breaking enemy morale and disrupting their war initiative. When they're doing it to us, on the other hand, it's called terror bombing, and it's a cowardly, despicable tactic intended to instill fear in the population by the ruthless slaughter of innocent women and children. It all depends on your point of view, really. The strategy of indiscriminate area bombing had been used prior to World War II, but it was during the war that it really got up to speed. The Nazis were targeting civilians with bombs from the very start of the war, and notably one of the aims of their Blitz bombing campaign against cities in the United Kingdom was to break the morale of the British civilian population. The British Royal Air Force began the war favouring precision, tactical bombing strikes against specific targets, but they soon got with the times and adopted an area bombing strategy against German cities, one of the aims of which was to break the morale of the German civilian population. And there were two main branches of thinking behind making civilians the target of bombing raids. There's the material reasoning and the psychological reasoning. And we'll talk about the material reasoning first. So, why spend time and resources trying to exclusively bomb small, mobile military targets that can fight back, when you can just fly behind those targets and bomb the factories and shipyards that are producing them? And those factories and shipyards supplying the military, they're staffed by civilians who usually live in nearby houses. They're also culpable to some degree for keeping the war machine going, right? And if we bomb them, there will be fewer workers to work at those factories, and therefore will reduce the enemy country's production and end the war quicker. So it's not that we want to bomb civilians, you see, it's simply that we think this will be less painful in the long run. Now, cities aren't solely comprised of war factories and worker housing, of course, but all the other things in the city, the non-military industries that keep those workers alive, the hospitals that heal them when they're sick and injured, the schools that educate their children, all these things are connected in varying degrees to the functioning of that society's capacity for war. So, following this logic, you can just bomb everything. by in effect reclassifying everything in the city as a military target. Once you've done this, bombing civilians is impossible, because there are no civilians. The city is just one big military installation. Now it is worth noting here that the United States did not enter the war with this mindset. In 1939, President Roosevelt sent an appeal to refrain from air bombing of civilians in various countries, and that reads as follows: "The ruthless bombing from the air of civilians in unfortified centres of population during the course of hostilities which have raged in various quarters of the earth during the past few years, which has resulted in the maiming and in the death of thousands of defenceless men, women and children, has sickened the hearts of every civilized man and woman, and has profoundly shocked the conscience of humanity. If resort is had to this form of inhuman barbarism during the period of the tragic conflagration with which the world is now confronted, hundreds of thousands of innocent human beings who have no responsibility for, and who are not even remotely participating in, the hostilities which have now broken out, will lose their lives. I am therefore addressing this urgent appeal to every government which may be engaged in hostilities publicly to affirm its determination that its armed forces shall in no event and under no circumstances undertake the bombardment from the air of civilian populations." So, some very high-minded words from a leader not yet in the war there. A few years later, however, the United States was in the war, and its military leaders saw things a little differently. And to quote General Curtis LeMay, "There are no innocent civilians. It is their government, and you are fighting a people. You are not trying to fight an armed force anymore, so it doesn't bother me so much to be killing these so-called innocent bystanders." LeMay's bombing strategy proceeded exactly as if he really believed there were no innocent civilians in Japan. Once Allied bombers were able to reach Japan, mass fire bombings of Japanese population centres began, killing and displacing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The firebombing of Tokyo on the 9th and 10th of March killed an estimated 100,000 people by itself and made 1 million more homeless. So, in the course of just a few years, the bombing of innocent civilians went from inhuman barbarism to there are no innocent civilians. Civilians were just another military asset to be bombed as far as the Allied Air Force was concerned. Now, the other line of reasoning for strategic bombing was the possible psychological effects that would result from the bombing of civilian population centres. Those being that perhaps the population would lose faith in their government, or the soldiers on the front lines would be demoralised by their families and homes being bombed while they were away, and all this would therefore lead to an increased likelihood for the enemy to surrender. And the material reasoning for the bombing was often used merely as a pretext for this actual psychological aim. Winston Churchill let this slip in a memo he drafted on the 28th of March, in which he addresses the controversial bombing of Dresden, which took place between the 13th and 15th of February. In this memo, Churchill says, "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities, simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. Otherwise we shall come into control of an utterly ruined land. The Foreign Secretary has spoken to me on this subject, and I feel the need for more precise concentration upon military objectives such as oil and communications behind the immediate battle zone, rather than on mere acts of terror and wanton destruction, however impressive." So, bombing simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts. So you're bombing civilians to break enemy morale, and if anyone gets squeamish about that, you say, "Oh, don't worry, I know we hit a few schools and hospitals there, but we were actually aiming at that factory a few streets over that makes boots for the army or something." Every city had something or other in it that supported the armed forces in some way, and thus there was always a handy excuse for indiscriminately area bombing anywhere. Now, this strategy is, and was at the time, very controversial, not just from a moral standpoint. I mean, that's obvious, you're blowing up innocent people, but it was also controversial in terms of its effectiveness. And first, let's talk about the effectiveness of area bombing's material goals. Firstly, even with the enormous amount of bombs which were dropped on Nazi Germany, the country's production actually increased throughout the war. And this happened for a few reasons, one of which was that Nazi Germany used millions of people as slave labour. Many German factories were staffed by prisoners. When you're a fascist regime occupying whole other countries, lives are very cheap. Also, whatever damage was done to German industry during indiscriminate area bombing raids on cities was relatively minor, because, to quote the Strategic Bombing Survey, as a rule the industrial plants were located around the perimeter of German cities, and characteristically these were relatively undamaged. Now, you could say Nazi Germany's production would have increased further without the area bombings, of course, but we're not talking about reducing production then, we're talking about slowing down the increase of production, which is less likely to be a major contributing factor to a surrender. We also have to consider here that while your air force is bombing civilian housing with the aim of breaking their morale, they're not bombing other things which it might be more useful to bomb. The Strategic Bombing Survey concludes that Allied bombing raids on, for instance, the Nazis' oil refineries and transportation network were key to hastening the end of the war. In particular, it calls the targeting of Germany's railways and waterways the decisive blow that completely disorganized the German economy. It also concludes that the importance of careful selection of targets for air attack is emphasized by the German experience. The Germans were far more concerned over attacks on one or more of their basic industries and services, their oil, chemical or steel industries or their power or transportation network, than they were over attacks on their armament industry or the city areas. So the specific targeting of key industries and transport networks was more effective than indiscriminate area bombing and the destruction of civilian housing, basically. Next, let's talk about the psychological effectiveness of area bombing. The thinking that area bombing would lead to a surrender caused by a breakdown in morale turned out to have a few flaws. Firstly, on the government end, militaristic, totalitarian, fascist regimes don't care about the opinions or well-being of their civilians. So they're not likely to throw in the towel just because lots of ordinary people are getting killed or injured or made homeless. They don't care about that. Caring about people is not high on the list of priorities for totalitarian fascist regimes. On the civilian end, there's several reasons why trying to break their morale didn't lead to the end of the war, beyond their governments not caring what they think. Firstly, as much as people might be terrorized by indiscriminate bombing raids, they were also already being terrorized by their own governments and the police force of those governments. It's one thing to have your morale shaken and decide things would be better if Hitler was gone, and it's another thing to translate that into action and go and fight the Gestapo. Someone might not like having their city bombed and their house burnt down, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to go out and rebel against the government and risk being executed. This is Arthur Harris, perhaps better known as Bomber Harris, who was the Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command during the height of the Second World War, and he oversaw the United Kingdom's area bombing campaign against German cities, including the bombing of Dresden. Now, as you might be able to tell from his nickname, Bomber Harris was a very enthusiastic supporter of area bombing. And he was also a very enthusiastic supporter of being honest about the point of area bombing. And let's read a quote of his from 1943. "The aim of the combined bomber offensive should be unambiguously stated as the destruction of German cities, the killing of German workers, and the disruption of civilized life throughout Germany. The destruction of houses, public utilities, transport and lives, the creation of a refugee problem on an unprecedented scale, and the breakdown of morale both at home and at the battlefronts by fear of extended and intensified bombing are accepted and intended aims of our bombing policy. They are not byproducts of attempts to hit factories." So when he said this, he was clearly in favour of area bombing as a tactic and also in favour of being honest about the aim of it. The point was to disrupt civilian life, kill people, and spread fear. However, after the war, Bomber Harris changed his mind. In his 1947 book, Bomber Offensive, Harris writes that while in 1941 it had seemed like a good idea to use area bombing to break the enemy's morale, in the long run it proved to be wholly unsound. And I quote, "When we had destroyed almost all the larger industrial cities in Germany, the civil population remained apathetic, while the Gestapo saw to it that they were docile, and insofar as there was work left for them to do, industrious. Morale bombing was comparatively ineffective against so well organised a police state as Germany. The German leaders themselves admitted after the war that morale was bad after our attacks on their towns, but they distinguished between the morale and the conduct of the workers. Conduct, they say, was unaffected. In other words, there was nothing unarmed Germans could do about it, with the Gestapo standing by and with the concentration camp round the corner. So that's the failure of morale bombing from someone who was previously both very in favour of it and directly responsible for it there. And the Strategic Bombing Survey also covers the same topic, saying if they, that's the German civilians, had been at liberty to vote themselves out of the war, they would have done so well before the final surrender. In a determined police state, however, there is a wide difference between dissatisfaction and expressed opposition. About the nicest thing you can say about this morale bombing idea is that some people apparently thought it might work, but it didn't. And it just so happens that in the course of it not working, it pointlessly killed, injured and displaced a very large number of innocent civilians. Attempts to break the morale of the German citizenry with terror bombing tactics led to apathy, not revolutionary action. And not to get too armchair general on you all here, but I don't mind concluding that every single bomb that was dropped on a German house would have been better put to use if it was dropped instead on a German railway line, or something else of actual military significance. However, I would like to make clear here that by no means am I saying we should absolve the entire German citizenry of all fault in the Second World War. Many civilians were, of course, committed supporters of the Nazi Party and often participants in its various crimes. When I say innocent civilians, I absolutely do not mean those people. However, many German citizens were innocent. Many were persecuted by the Nazis themselves, or many were children, for instance, and sadly, indiscriminate area bombing does not discern between these groups of people. Now, all this is important for us today because the manner in which the atomic bombs were targeted and used was merely an extension of this morale bombing philosophy. So let's talk a little about that. In the months before the atomic bomb was used, a group of scientists and military personnel dubbed the Target Committee was established by director of the Manhattan Project, General Leslie Groves, and this group met several times to discuss how the bombs should be used. And the minutes of the meetings of the Target Committee give us an insight into the thinking behind the target selection for the bombs. On the 10th of May, the group met in the office of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the head of the laboratory that designed the bombs and one of the scientists on the committee. And they discussed various points relating to how the bombs should be used. One key point for us here is the section Psychological Factors in Target Selection, and that reads as follows. It was agreed that psychological factors in the target selection were of great importance. Two aspects of this are 1. Obtaining the greatest psychological effect against Japan, and 2. Making the initial use sufficiently spectacular